This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. This week, Radio 4 welcomes back the sage of Berkhamsted, writer, thinker and all-round cultural colossus. But enough of me. Also back the curmudgeonly comic creation that is Ed Reardon, here reading the weekend papers.
Money. Haven't got any. Travel. Never go anywhere. Family. No longer have one. Work. Sport it is. Oh, for heaven's sake. Is there no human activity that's not wryly observed by David Mitchell?
No. Of course, curmudgeonly is just how some of you feel about much of Radio 4's comic output. We'll be delving deeper into the mystery of what might be called Marmite comedy. I'm sure that Ed Reardon hasn't tried complaining formally to the BBC. We'd never hear the end of it if he had. Listener Paul Beckwith has had a go, concerned that one of his favourite programmes is no longer available on podcast.
Well, I'm sitting here in front of my computer, so let's see how long it takes before I get fed up trying to contact the BBC. Click on Contact Us. It takes you to a completely confusing page which tells you about questions, comments and suggestions. Try making a complaint. You get another page and it says Complain Online.
We'll be back to hear how Paul's getting on, or isn't, a little later, and we'll find out more about the BBC plans for revamping its complaint system. According to many of you, speeding things up a bit would be a good place to start. Since November last year, listeners have been complaining about a problem with the local radio iPlayer and the intrusive clicks, crackles and pops that have infested the audio stream. Is this a conspiracy to run down local radio? Wondered listener Solomon. In February, feedback was told that in fact the problem was due to something called a failing motherboard and would be fixed by early March. So, is all now serene and click-free? Well, perhaps it's only still affecting a few stations.
BBC Newcastle Radio for the North East Shania Twain.
BBC Radio Devon coming up at 5:15. Morning to our friend Margaret in Prince Royal.
BBC Radio Northampton.
And this is your lunchtime.
Loving where you live.
BBC Radio Stoke.
Oh dear, local radio listeners are not amused.
Hi, my name is David Small from Newcastle upon Tyne. At first I thought it was a problem with my radio, but when I listened to it online, it was the same sounds of the popping and clicking. Well, in this day and age, it shouldn't take 5 months to fix.
Hello, this is Brian Winter from Caswick Garrison in North Yorkshire. It was stated that the fault would be fixed in mid to early March. Here we are now in mid-April. I was listening to BBC Tees this morning and the noises are still there, but it's very irritating. It really is a shame that the BBC cannot put right a problem. It does seem to have gone on for quite a long time now.
Alan Ross is head of technology for the BBC English regions. I played him a little click. Now, what is actually happening there, Alan Ross?
We're not entirely sure what's going on, which is why we can't be 100% certain that we're going to fix it. But we think there's some sort of timing problem on the signals, and the glitches that you hear are the unit trying to resynchronize and to put everything back in step.
But you'd agree they're quite irritating, aren't they?
They are very irritating. I certainly agree with that. In the case of local radio streaming, we don't have full resilience built into the design, because at the time that we did the installation, it was done at a cost that matched the kind of birth of the service.
That sounds as if local radio got a second-class service and the cheapest method available, and that now everybody's paying the price.
No, that's not the case. This equipment was installed around 8 years ago and was very much at the dawn of internet radio. Most people hadn't really heard of streaming audio at that time.
But this particular problem now has been going on since November. What are you saying now?
Yes, well, hopefully we will have the problem resolved within the next week or so.
But why should we believe you with respect this time, whereas we've been twice told that it would be ready in April and before that in early March, and it hasn't been?
Well, the unit that's failed is something called an intraplex matrix, but after quite a bit of work, they eventually declared it to be unrepairable. These things are not off-the-shelf items, they're on long lead times.
Well, as you will know, a number of our listeners have found it so unpleasant that, for example, Sam has told us to listen to BBC Radio Devon that he's drastically cut down on the amount he's listened to. Are you aware about any drop in numbers because of this?
Well, we're certainly aware that listeners have become frustrated and understand that, but we should view this in the context that it's a very small proportion of our audience, around 0.1%, who listen to local radio on the internet.
Yeah, but some of those, listener Richard Oliver, for example, thought their own equipment was faulty until they heard the issue raised on feedback, and they couldn't find any sort of explanation or apology on the iPlayer.
Well, individual stations have made on-air apologies.
But has there been any notice on the iPlayer? It would seem to be a basic courtesy, wouldn't it?
Yes, possibly, but I think part of the problem has been that we anticipated that we were going to get the problem fixed. I had hoped that it would have been done quicker than that it has, and it will be fixed. The changeover is actually scheduled for the overnight between the April the 11th and the 12th.
Our thanks to Alan Ross, and in fact we've been told there is an apology on the iPlayer help page. I hope it helps. So, normal service will be resumed next week, perhaps. Until then, listeners can console themselves with a clutch of new comedy series starting on Radio 4 this week.
Weeknights at the home of radio comedy. This week, 4 new series, including the return...
Then again, some of you might prefer to listen to digital clicks. Comedy is notoriously divisive. For every stone-faced critic who simply cannot bear Count Arthur Strong, there are plenty who worship him.
My name's Lizzie Clark. I originally come from Eccles, where the Eccles cakes are made, but I now live in Lee. And I think with Count Arthur, you've just got to know him, and I think you've got to have time to listen. It's very simple, very easy, very slow. Nothing sarcastic and nasty, and he's my hero.
My name's Julia Vaughan. I live in Wirksworth in Derbyshire. I find it fascinating how Count Arthur Strong has created such polarised opinions. I think it's hysterically funny, and all the controversy about the humour feels as if it means it actually touches a nerve. It reminded me of me and my brother who used to watch Monty Python when it was first on TV, and our mother just couldn't bear to be in the room because she said it insulted her intelligence.
What makes us laugh or leaves us cold is notoriously difficult to predict. So how do you go about writing or commissioning a comedy programme for millions of Radio 4 listeners? I invited 2 comedy writers to discuss the risks of alienating half the audience. Andrew Nichols, co-writer of Ed Reardon's Week, which is now back on air, and Catherine Jakeways, who created North by Northamptonshire. We were joined in the studio by commissioning editor Caroline Raphael, and I began by asking her why she'd given the go-ahead to one of the most loathed and admired comic characters anywhere on radio. Count Arthur, of course.
Because I happen to think, along with many of our listeners, but I do appreciate not all, that it's a great comic character that you can just revel in his adventures week after week.
Did you suspect it would divide the audience as much as it has?
No, to be honest, I didn't. The fact that it does is a shame, because one would like everybody to absolutely adore everything, but sometimes they won't. It's just like when you meet people, there are bits of people you love and bits of people, of people that there are things about them you hate, and life's not anodyne. You don't want everything kind of conforming to some kind of mean.
You don't get hold of the writer, Count Arthur himself, of course, all in one,
and
Count,
say
to him, yes, if you do something slightly differently, perhaps you could broaden your appeal. You're shaking your head. You wouldn't tell him that?
No, I wouldn't. We do tell writers to perhaps consider certain things, but it might be in terms of just telling the story better or making things clearer. In the end, if it divides people, and I'm really sorry.
Well, can I bring in Andrew Nichols here, who's created one of the great Radio 4 comic characters, of course, Ed Reardon. Andrew, would you slightly alter or think of altering Ed Reardon's character to appeal to even more people?
No, I think we push him as far as we can. We keep pushing him, and people think he's a sweet old gentleman. But I do think it's an artificial argument in a way, because there is room for both. People like the Goons, or people prefer Hancock. I mean, as you might expect. I'm a Hancock, on
Me
the
too,
Hancock
yeah.
side of the fence. But that's not to, gainsay all the Goons fans that still are out there. And I think it's the same thing, essentially.
Well, can I bring in Catherine Jakeways? Do you have a view of the person you're writing it for?
North by Northamptonshire was the first proper thing that I'd written before. I'd just written sketches and monologues for myself. My show started as a sort of stage show. It was characters doing monologues, all of whom were played by me. And part of the process of it before it was commissioned was working out with the help of the team at Radio 4 and my producer particularly, how it was all going to work, whether it was going to be a sketch show, whether it was going to be in front of a studio audience. I was told that they were thinking of it for the morning slot, so obviously that naturally shaped the way you sort of plan for it.
And of course, the average age of the Radio 4 listener is in the 50s, and you are substantially short of that.
Thanks very much.
Do you find that
Getting
rather
less
strange?
short of that all the time.
You find it rather strange there, writing for an older audience?
I've actually always found it easier to write for a sort of generation above. I think I've always slightly written about and for my parents' generation, although they're older than 50s. But you write whatever you think is going to be funny, and if that appeals to everybody else, then great.
Andrew Nichols, when you write, do you have a listener in mind?
No, well, we have each other in mind. I co-write it with Christopher Douglas, who plays Ed. And what happens is, if it makes us laugh, then it stays in. It's not so much we think of the audience, but what we don't think of is they'll never get this. We trust the audience.
Where did he come from, Ed Reardon?
Well, it came out of failure. It came out of our particular circumstances, and the way commissioning and writing and success and lack of it had gone. I think rather like Ed, it had peaked in the 70s.
Catherine, are you writing for a Radio 4 audience which likes to flatter itself that it's more intelligent than most? Do you have that in mind?
You do, and you hope that you assume very much with a Radio 4 audience that the listener's going to be a certain demographic. But I think then the implication isn't, I hope, that if you were writing for television that you would dumb it down. You were always assuming a certain level of intelligence and a certain sophistication.
I really would like to say something about the age, because the average age of the Radio 4 audience is in their sort of mid-50s, and I just think it's worth remembering that this is the audience that watched the young ones, that grew up with the early days of alternative comedy, and I think there's a slight danger of over-characterising what it means to be in your mid-50s and what it means to be in your mid-50s on Radio 4. There may be issues around what people expect from Radio 4, which we do like to challenge, but being in your mid-50s, if you think about what you grew up on, it's pretty much what is still on television and what is still, if you go to the comedy clubs, you go to Edinburgh.
Can I ask you about what happens, though, when you hear for the first time a really original comic voice creation and you want to bring it to Radio 4?
A lot has to go on. You can go to a comedy show anywhere in the country and see wonderful acts and character work like Catherine's. The development of North by Northamptonshire also reminds me of what we had to do with League of Gentlemen, which started off as a series of beautifully written, as were Catherine's, characters, but there was no framework. So what you're looking for is a world in which you can set these characters that means you can come back to it week after week, and then hopefully it will develop.
Andrew, if television came and said it's time, Ed Reardon, you've won all his world, Broadcasting Press Guild, Radio 4,
surely.
You're going to say, no, he's going to stay on Radio 4.
People ranging from my El Mando Iannucci to my wife and kids have been trying to get Ed on television for 5 or 6 years.
But it wouldn't change if he went on television.
I don't know. A lot of the critics who tend to be very nice about Ed.
Well, give you awards, yeah.
For God's sake, yes. For God's sake, please never put him on television, because we have a certain idea in our heads of what Ed is. I think what does enter into the equation are the demographics. I think the problem is it, star heavy enough, or is it a sort of show that will work with a wide audience? I mean, obviously, I think it is. But,
of course. Catherine, will there be a third series if you have your way of North by Northamptonshire?
Am I allowed to say, Caroline, that I think there is going to be a third series?
There is indeed. This time next year.
Pleased to say, yes. So we're in the process of starting to decide what's going to happen in the third series at the moment.
Our thanks to Catherine Jakeways, Caroline Raphael and Andrew Nichols. Now, before we move on, I wonder where Paul Beckwith has got to in his attempts to make a complaint about podcasts.
Please select what you want to complain about. Television, radio, online, iPlayer. For some reason, there's nothing that says podcasts or lack of podcasts. So let's just say radio. Next question.
Let's hope Paul has a breakthrough soon. We're not on the air for much longer. In fact, if you're listening to Friday's edition, we're on the air for a whole 4 minutes less than usual. Sunday's repeat is the normal length, but Friday's slimline version is due to a little jostling in the Radio 4 schedule to make room for the Listening Project, Radio 4's new series which aims to eavesdrop on the nation's conversations. Of course, we aren't the only programme to be packaged in different shapes and sizes. In Our Time shrinks substantially in the evening, as does midweek. John Farrago wonders how the conjuring trick is done.
I've been an avid listener to BBC Radio for more than 70 years, and I'm fascinated to know how programmes are made. In particular, I'm sure I'm not the only listener who would like to know how 45-minute programmes like Start the Week and In Our Time are edited to fit a 30-minute slot on the evening of the same day.
Katie Hickman is the producer of Start the Week, which also has a shortened evening repeat.
Hello. You may remember that a few weeks ago we were taking the temperature of conservatism in Britain. Well, today, after George Galloway's by-election win in Bradford and his derisive comments about the collapse of socialism...
This week, presenter Andrew Marr was joined by author Alwyn Turner, MP Tristram Hunt and cartoonist Martin Rowson to consider the possible death of socialism. Katie allowed us into the editing suite to watch her slash and burn.
So Start the Week finishes and I say goodbye to the guests, I say goodbye to Andrew. I then get myself a very strong cup of coffee and I take the notes that I have written during the programme up to my desk. I load up the programme onto my desktop and I take out a third of that programme for the evening repeat. So this is the programme, this waveform that you can see. You have to make those decisions. Do I just salami slice, chop out odd clauses here and bits there, or do I have to take out whole sections? And when you're taking out 14 minutes, you have to be quite ruthless. You have to think, is this necessary? Do I need to keep this in to make it understandable, the ideas that we've been talking about? We encourage the guests to get involved, to ask questions, to think about the other people's ideas. And so you don't want to lose that. That would be the easiest thing to lose. And Andrew would just individually interview the 3 or 4 guests. But I think that you would lose so much in that. Tristram Hunt, actually, he speaks really well. He does and ah a bit.
1989, and this notion that the traditional Marxist vision of socialism.
If someone ums a lot, I will take out some of those. I don't want to take them all out because for me, sometimes an and ah sounds like someone's thinking. So you find the beginning of it, and then and then you realise there's 2 ofs. We might as well take the second of. So it's highlighted in red. Play over that clip.
Marxist vision of socialism was beginning.
Kind of sounds okay. What you are not trying to do is change the meaning or change the sense of anything. Sadly, it's some of the colour that goes. I mean, I've had programmes where you agonise. When we did Richard Holloway, I think, a couple of weeks ago, he has a beautiful turn of phrase when he talks.
There was an English theologian who said that Christianity is like a swimming pool. All the noise is at the shallow end. And I think that what a lot of it...
He'd said, the noisy end of Christianity is the shallow end. And then a friend emailed me and said, it's trending on Twitter at the moment. And you think, I've just cut that out. It's gone. It's not always easy to decide what to keep in and what to take out. If a guest has said something that is wrong and they will say to me after, I didn't actually mean that, I meant that, or Andrew will say the wrong town. And also if someone libels someone or somebody does something, why would I keep that in? There is a defence about live programmes that I don't have. When I send out something that is in the evening, I want to make sure that it is accurate, that I'm not misrepresenting anybody in it, and that the guests sound as good as they can do.
Katie Hickman, scalpel in hand. Now, Paul, how are you getting on?
How did you watch or listen to the thing on broadcast? Oh, it's not an option to select. We'll put it on demand iPlayer. Next question. How far into this programme did the issue happen? Well, there isn't. That's not applicable. If you do go through all these forms and actually log a complaint, they'll send you a response. In order to reply to their reply, you actually have to fill in a whole new complaint form, filling in all the boxes again. It's so good that BBC Radio is so responsive to their customers' needs.
Paul is far from being the only listener to criticise the BBC complaints procedure. In fact, back in July 2011, Lord Patten himself, chairman of the BBC Trust, reviewed the process and declared that it must be made faster, simpler and easier to understand. To that end, the BBC Trust is currently holding a public consultation into the way complaints are handled. Richard Eyre is the trustee in charge, so I asked him whether Chris Patten's phrase implies that the current system is slow, complex and hard to understand.
Well, the honest answer to that is it can sometimes be grindingly slow, and it can be unclear to complainants where they should first go to make a complaint. And we want to give them one place where, if they go to the website, or if they use a particular free phone number, or if they write to a particular address, they are certain that their complaint will be logged centrally, so we know who has complained about what, and they'll get the fastest and most authoritative possible response.
I didn't know, to be frank, that every year the BBC has 240,000 editorial complaints. And when we look at those 240,000 editorial complaints, only 0.05%, 110 actually, went on to appeal to the Trust. Do you think that's a reasonable proportion?
It would be crazy, wouldn't it, to set some sort of arbitrary proportion. You can't judge the success of the appeals procedure by the number of appeals, but by the quality of the judgments. All of those are available in detail on our website.
And you also judge it by how satisfied, in part anyway, how satisfied the complainant is.
In any public-facing organisation, you expect to get a lot of complaints, and by and large, you expect that people whose complaints don't end up being agreed with by the organisation probably don't feel very satisfied. What's important is that we're fair in our consideration of complaints. And I could tell you about some complaints which come to us which, your listeners would be amazed at some of the things which are appealed to the Trust.
Do tell us.
Well, 100 pages complaining about one sentence in the Today programme, parsing it analytically for its grammar, its use of syntax, all of which may or may not have been justified, but it doesn't raise an issue of the editorial guidelines which govern the making of BBC programmes. Now, we're going to be able to treat those in a different way in future. They will be read, they'll be considered, they will get one answer, but unless they raise an issue of substance, they won't be taken further, because that's not cost-effective. But that's a tiny minority. The overwhelming number of people who complain to the BBC complain because they care about the BBC. They care passionately for the BBC. And when they think it has let them down, they want us to do something about it. And they're right to complain. We want to hear about those complaints.
Tell me about the timetable. When can we expect any new system to be implemented?
Well, I would expect that we'll determine the final shape of these changes during the summer, and with the hope that it'll be implemented in the autumn. And I'd be happy to come back and talk to you about it when and if your listeners think it's improved.
I admire your bravery. Now, can we just talk about the things that you're already going ahead with implementing? You're creating a corrections and clarifications page on the BBC website. How do you see that working? Who's going to input to that?
Well, the BBC executive are going to appoint a chief complaints editor, who he or she will work direct to the Director General, with the idea that from time to time a complaint comes in which is so obviously a misjudgment by the BBC that it needs to be short-circuited, and someone with real authority in the BBC has to recognise that complaint, take it out of the system, apologise for it and put it right.
Turning to Paul Beckwith's concerns, which you've heard, do you have any sympathy for him?
Of course I've got sympathy for him, and we hope in redesigning the complaints page on the website to clearly make it a much simpler process.
Well, here's a suggestion. You obviously want to road test the new system. How about inviting Mr. Beckwith to be the first person to road test it?
I'd be delighted to hear from Mr. Beckwith by the 19th of April as part of our consultation exercise, and I guarantee to him that I personally will read his response.
Our thanks to Richard Eyre. And if you'd like to take part in the consultation, all the details are on the Trust's website. Now a plea for some questions for us from you. On next week's programme, I'll be speaking to our leader, Gwyneth Williams, the controller of Radio 4, so please let me know what you'd like me to ask her. You can write to feedback, P.O. Box 67234, London SE1P 4AX, or you can leave a phone message on 03 333 444 544. Standard landline charges apply, but it could cost more on some mobile networks. Or you can email feedback@bbc.co.uk. All those details are on our website. One of the things I'll be trying to find out is more about the controller's plans to fold excess baggage into an extended Saturday Live at the end of this month. Andrea Maestrello is baffled.
My instant reaction was just I was very upset to think that this programme was going to be consumed. Excess baggage. There are so many memorable ones, from sounding intoxicated taking a bus to people riding horses across deserts. They're so much more memorable. And maybe because it's half an hour and it's compact and they have people live in the studio, it's just so much more interesting.
Daniel Cini and Philippa tweeted to say how sad they'll be to see the freestanding excess baggage go, while Andrew Wiggins put it more strongly. He is mortified to see the end of what he calls a brilliant and yet so simple show. I'll also ask Miss Williams about her decision last autumn to extend The World at One to 45 minutes. Many feedback listeners are still unhappy about that move. Graham Hyland says he stopped listening to The World at One altogether, and is not the only one. Here's Barbara Fawcett from Beverley in North Yorkshire.
It's been a huge disappointment that it's been expanded beyond our point of interest, and I actually think probably a lot of other people's points of interest. I personally don't feel that people actually asked if they wanted the news extending till 1:45 and this little lecture jobby. I feel it was maybe a financial expedient. I'm honestly not sure. For us, it's been a massive disappointment, and our radio listening is really quite dramatically reduced because of it.
I'll see if I can get the controller to review her decision. And do let me know what else you'd like me to ask Gwyneth Williams, and I'll do my best to get some answers. And the last word on the subject of comedy goes to Bill MacDonald. He's not a fan of Count Arthur Strong or Wordaholics, and he was not impressed by my offer in last week's programme of an intimate dinner for a fee with myself and the lovely Samantha from I'm Sorry, I Haven't a Clue.
I'm disturbed that Samantha and Roger Bolton should be mentioned in the same breath. I'm sure that Samantha would give her full attention to our points when we raised them, whereas Roger Bolton is clearly an imaginary character. As for Count Arthur Strong and Wordaholics, for goodness sake, get them off. Count Arthur and Wordaholics, that is. Not Samantha, who, of course, rarely has them on.
Well, as I don't exist, I can't comment. So goodbye.
You live.
BBC Radio Stoke.
Oh dear, local radio listeners are not amused.
Hi, my name is David Small from Newcastle upon Tyne. At first I thought it was a problem with my radio, but when I listened to it online, it was the same sounds of the popping and clicking. Well, in this day and age, it shouldn't take 5 months to fix.
Hello, this is Brian Winter from Catterick Garrison in North Yorkshire. It was stated that the fault would be fixed in mid to early March. Here we are now in mid-April. I was listening to BBC Tees this morning and the noises are still there.
And would be fixed by early March. So, is all now serene and click-free? Well, perhaps it's only still affecting a few stations.
BBC Newcastle Radio for the North East Shania Twain.
BBC Radio Devon coming up, so 5:15. Morning to our friend Margaret in Prince Robert.
BBC Radio Northampton.
And this is your lunchtime.
Loving where you...
Observed by David Mitchell.
No, of course, curmudgeonly is just how some of you feel about much of Radio 4's comic output. We'll be delving deeper into the mystery of what might be called Marmite comedy. I'm sure that Ed Reardon hasn't tried complaining formally to the BBC. We'd never hear the end of it if he had. Listener Paul Beckwith has had a go, concerned that one of his favourite programmes is no longer available on podcast.
Well, I'm sitting here in front of my computer, so let's see how long it takes before I get fed up trying to contact the BBC. Click on Contact Us. It takes you to a completely confusing page.
This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. This week, Radio 4 welcomes back the sage of Berkhamsted, writer, thinker and all-round cultural colossus. But enough of me. Also back the curmudgeonly comic creation that is Ed Reardon, here reading the weekend papers.
Money. Haven't got any. Travel. Never go anywhere. Family. No longer have one. Work. Sport it is. Oh, for heaven's sake. Is there no human activity that's not Riley...
Which tells you about questions, comments and suggestions. Try making a complaint. You get another page and it says complain online.
We'll be back to hear how Paul's getting on or isn't a little later, and we'll find out more about the BBC plans for revamping its complaint system. According to many of you, speeding things up a bit would be a good place to start. Since November last year, listeners have been complaining about a problem with the local radio iPlayer and the intrusive clicks, crackles and pops that have infested the audio stream. Is this a conspiracy to run down local radio? Wondered listener Solomon. In February, feedback was told that in fact the problem was due to something called a failing motherboard.